The second room of the community center had thin walls and no windows. The overhead light buzzed quietly, not enough to distract, but enough to remind me I was somewhere real. I sat on a folding chair with one hand wrapped gently around my rosary, the other resting on my lap. Across from me, in a small circle of metal chairs and cautious bodies, were 5 women, 2 of them mothers, one with bruises still fading around her jaw, all of them barely breathing when they arrived. We don't speak for the first few minutes. I never force that dot instead. I begin the way I always do. Softly. Slowly. As if I am reciting a story I once read in someone else's life, only it lives under my skin. My name is Margaret, I say, with a small nod. I'm 71 years old, and I spent 37 of those years believing that God wanted me to suffer. The room doesn't gasp. There's just a stillness that sharpens. I thought his will was written in the way Thomas twisted my wrist. I continue, voice even, in the way he dragged me into prayer after every blow, asking God to fix the rebellion inside me. Stillness turns to listening. I let the words linger for a moment, then exhale through my nose. That was my life. But this room, I say, looking around at them, at women who flinch when the door creaks. This room is where lies go to die. It took me years to say things that plainly, but now I do, because no one else ever had the courage to tell me what I needed to hear when I was their age, or even younger. You don't have to share today, I tell them, but I want you to know something. The woman you see in front of you, the one who wears her hair neatly, who speaks gently, who brings baked goods to the front desk, she didn't always look like this. I pause, letting the rosary slide gently through my fingers. She used to hide in closets. She used to memorize the sound of boots on stairs. She used to pray not for strength but for disappearance. One of the women, Lana, I believe, covers her mouth. She isn't crying, not yet. She's remembering something she thought only she had lived through. That's how it always starts. After the meeting, I gather the teacups and straighten the chairs. The volunteers always offer, but I like the quiet that comes after the storm. The hallway outside the second room smells like cinnamon and bleach. Someone in the kitchen is reheating soup. There's a draft under the back door that no one's gotten around to fixing. I don't mind. This place was never meant to be perfect, only safe. I pass the bulletin board where the flyers are posted. Single Mothers Support Group, Mondays. Grief Circle. ESL for immigrant women. None of these existed when I first walked in here 20 years ago. Hollowed out and silent. Back then, I sat where Lana sits now. Back then, my hands shook too much to hold a cup of tea, but I came. And then I kept coming, until the day they handed me a ring of keys and said, "Margaret, maybe you should lead the next session." I remember holding those keys like they were holy relics. By late afternoon, the building grows quiet again. The air carries that particular softness of winter. Sun slipping away. I walk into the front office where Nora, the receptionist, is sorting donated scarves. She looks up with a smile that always makes me think of my sister. "Did it go okay?" she asks. "Better than okay," I say, removing my coat. "Someone cried." Nora laughs. "That's your measure of success?" "It means she felt safe. Enough to feel something," I reply. I sit at the corner desk and reach for my planner. There's a name penciled in next to Tuesday. Rev. D. Callahan, along with a note, wants to discuss partnership for Battered Wives Ministry. I trace the ink with my finger and wonder how many sermons he's given about women staying silent for peace. I'm always cautious when pastors call, but I agree to meet. I always do. Evening comes and I stay later than I meant to. The other volunteers have gone home. The parking lot is empty except for my car and a single crow hopping near the curb. I open the window a crack to let in the night air, cold and unforgiving. I sit back in my chair and close my eyes. My fingers find the rosary again. It's not just a habit. It's a pulse. I don't use it the way I once did. Back then, I clutched it as if pain made me holy, as if bruises were some kind of tithe. Now, it's just a rope I held onto long enough to pull myself out of a well. Sometimes I still hear Thomas's voice in my sleep. Not the screaming, not the threats, the prayers. Break her, Lord, if that's what it takes. He believed every word. And for too many years, so did I. I remember the day that changed. I was 39, sitting on the kitchen floor, bleeding from the lip he'd split with the heel of his palm. The window over the sink was open. A robin had landed on the ledge, looking at me the way only animals can, without pity, without opinion. Just watching. It struck me suddenly how quiet the bird was, and how my house had never known silence. Only prayers shouted into the mouth of violence. That was the first time. I wondered if maybe God hadn't sent the pain. Maybe he was sending the bird. I opened my eyes now and pressed the rosary to my lips. Tomorrow, I'll visit a woman at the shelter, across town, who's just filed for divorce. I'll bring her a basket of muffins and sit with her while she unpacks whatever memories surface. We never rush them. Memories unfold like bruises, changing color, revealing shapes, refusing to be ignored. I tuck my scarf into my collar, grab my coat, and head out into the cold. The wind stings my cheeks, but I breathe it in anyway. It reminds me I'm alive, and no longer afraid of the man who once knelt beside my wounds and called them divine. The first time Thomas told me I was a failure in God's eyes, I was 22 and still believed holiness could be earned. I stood barefoot in our narrow kitchen, slicing carrots for stew. The light over the sink flickered from a storm the night before, and Thomas had been quiet most of the morning. That kind of quiet always meant he was building something behind his eyes. You could feel it, a storm with folded arms I had balanced. The checkbook that morning, just like my mother taught me. I found a charge I didn't recognize, $100 missing, spent at a hardware store. When I asked him what it was for, Thomas turned from the hallway, Bible still in his hand. He didn't shout, not at first. He set the Bible down gently on the counter, beside the carrots, and said, "A good wife doesn't inspect her husband's decisions." I remember wiping my hands on a dish towel, trying to keep my voice even. "It's just ... We were short on rent last month." He didn't answer. He just stared, then moved slowly toward the drawer near the stove and pulled it open, not to grab a fork or a spoon, but the leather belt he kept rolled in the back corner. That was the first time. He didn't strike me hard. It was more like a warning, a flick across the back of my legs. But it left a welt. And what came after hurt worse. He made me kneel in the corner beside the heater, hands folded, eyes closed, and listen to him pray. "Lord," he began, "teach my wife obedience, rebuke the spirit of control. Help her see that submission is not weakness, but godliness." I listened with my eyes squeezed shut and my stomach twisting. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't afraid, but because I thought I was supposed to be. I thought this was the refining fire Scripture spoke about. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if perhaps Sarah, from the Old Testament, had felt the same lost in a house ruled by a man who claimed to know God better. We'd met at church camp. Thomas led the morning devotionals and taught boys how to fish in the afternoons. He had an honest jawline and eyes that people trusted. I was drawn in the way a moth is drawn to a steady flame warmth first, then burned. My parents were proud. He was the kind of man you prayed for, they said. Strong, respected. A man after God's own heart. I never told them that on our honeymoon. Thomas said my laugh was too loud, That he tightened his grip around my arm when I took too long to get ready for church. That he pinched the skin above my waist if I asked too many questions at dinner. Small things. That's how it began. Small enough to excuse. Small enough to explain that small seeds become vines. And vines have a way of taking over everything if you don't cut them back. By our 3rd year of marriage, we were living in a modest, 1-bedroom house on the edge of town. I worked part-time at a bookstore, mostly shelving devotionals and recommending novels to lonely women with small hands. Thomas worked construction and did maintenance for the church on weekends. Everyone called him Brother Thomas. They said he had a servant's heart. At home, that heart turned cold. The rules were simple. Dinner by 6, house clean, no makeup, no pants. I followed them mostly because disobedience meant another punishment. But there were days I forgot. Days I left laundry in the dryer too long or laughed too loud at the TV. He always prayed before hurting me. I think that's what made it worse. There was a performance to it, an illusion of righteousness wrapped around cruelty. He'd lay his hand on my head first, like I was a lamb needing correction, and whisper, "God, forgive her pride." Then the blows came. Afterward, he'd help me to bed. He'd stroke my hair and say, "I only do this because I love you." And I believed him. I stopped writing letters to my sister after Thomas read one and tore it to shreds in front of me. "Family meddling is how Satan enters marriages," he said. He kept the phone in his glove box during the day. At night, he slept with the cordless base on his side of the bed. Even the house started shrinking. Rooms felt smaller. Windows more narrow. There were days I didn't speak at all, but I still prayed. Not for freedom. Not yet. I prayed to be better. More obedient, less rebellious. I believed God would reward my quiet suffering with peace. That maybe one day, Thomas would soften. That love could grow from ashes, if you just stayed long enough. In the smoke, one evening as I folded laundry, I came across an old photograph from our wedding day. I was smiling, my veil catching sunlight near the church steps. Thomas stood beside me, proud and upright, but I didn't recognize the woman in the photo. Her smile was wide. Yes, but her shoulders were hunched as if bracing already. Her eyes looked past the camera, as though searching for the version of herself she might become if only she were good enough. Sat on the edge of the bed and wept into a pillow. Not loud, not uncontrollably. Just a steady, aching kind of cry. The kind that comes when you realize the life you built is hollow, and the faith you trusted may have been twisted into a leash. Years later, I'd meet women who'd say things like, "I stayed for the children," or "I stayed because I didn't have anywhere else to go." Me? I stayed because I thought leaving meant disobeying God. I stayed because the prayers that followed the bruises were louder than the bruises themselves. And no one ever told me different. It was a Sunday morning when I first thought about leaving. Thomas had preached the short devotion in the living room before church. That was his routine. He'd stand by the mantel with his Bible, barefoot, eyes sharp, his voice commanding as if we were a congregation of hundreds and not just the two of us. He liked to recite from Ephesians. "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands, as unto the Lord." He always paused on that verse, let it settle into the air like smoke. That morning, I was wearing a lavender dress I hadn't worn in years. It still fit, though a little tighter around the waist. As I stepped into the hallway, he looked up from his Bible and frowned. "That color draws attention," he said. "It's church," I replied softly. "Don't we want to bring our best before God?" He closed the book. God wants humility, not spectacle. He made me change. And he stood by the door while I did it, watching, always watching, as if I might betray righteousness with a sleeve or a smile. We walked to church in silence. He kept his hand on the small of my back. From the outside, it might have looked tender, but I knew the pressure in that palm. It was control, plain and simple. The sanctuary was already full when we arrived. Wooden pews lined with familiar faces, the scent of aging hymnals and cheap perfume thick in the air. Sister Mabel handed out bulletins, and Deacon Paul was arranging chairs near the back. Everyone smiled when we entered. Everyone always smiled. I sat beside Thomas in the third row, just behind the Wilsons. During the sermon I listened, as I always did, but I listened differently that day. Pastor Jacobs was speaking about mercy, about the story of the woman caught in adultery, how the crowd wanted to stone her, and Jesus said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." That verse had never struck me the way it did that morning. I looked around and saw people nodding, murmuring amen. But I wondered, what would they do if they knew what happened in our house? Would they still see Thomas as the faithful husband? Or would they look at me differently? Would they still believe he was the man without sin? After the service, I lingered near the back door while Thomas spoke with the elders. I overheard Sister Joy whisper to someone that she admired our marriage, how obedient I was, how respectful. I nearly laughed, not out of humor but grief. They didn't see obedience. They saw bruises they didn't recognize. That same week, I arranged a meeting with Pastor Jacobs. I told Thomas I needed to visit a friend from the bookstore, that she was sick and needed prayer. He nodded and said, "Don't stay too long." I arrived at the church office with my rosary in my pocket, fingers already moving across the beads. The church secretary offered me tea. I declined. When I stepped into the pastor's study, I remember being struck by the painting's framed verses, images of doves and shepherds. The air smelled like old books and lemon oil. Pastor Jacobs sat behind his desk, smiling warmly. He was a heavy man with soft hands and a face that rarely held suspicion. "What's on your heart, Margaret?" he asked gently. I hesitated. I am struggling, I began, with my role as a wife. He folded his hands. "Marriage is a challenge for many." I nodded, fumbling to shape the truth into something palatable. Thomas ... he gets angry. Sometimes he ... disciplines me. And afterward, he prays. He says God uses him to correct me. The room seemed to shift. His brow furrowed, but his voice remained composed. "Discipline?" he asked. I looked down at my lap. "He believes I dishonor God when I challenge him," he says. "He's acting in spiritual authority." Pastor Jacob sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Margaret, Scripture does speak to submission. It's part of the divine order of the home." "But," I said quickly, my voice trembling, "does it speak to pain? To bruises? To fear?" He didn't answer right away. Then he offered the kind of response that lodges like a thorn. "God allows trials to refine us. Your suffering might be the cross you're meant to bear for his growth too. Marriage is sanctification, not comfort." I wanted to believe he misunderstood, that he couldn't imagine what I meant. But the truth was simpler. He knew, and he chose to bless the pain. That night, Thomas noticed the silence in me. He always did. Silence was my only rebellion. "What did she say?" he asked, assuming I'd gone to see my friend. "She's fine," I replied. "Didn't need prayer after all." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. Sometimes people think they need saving when all they really need is obedience. He kissed my forehead and went to the kitchen to wash up. I sat in the hallway, hands clasped over my rosary, and wondered what kind of God I was following. Was he the God of bruised cheeks and stitched lips? Was he the voice Thomas used to echo his own? That night, I didn't sleep. I turned to the book of Psalms and read in the dim light. The Lord is near to the broken-hearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Crushed. That word lingered. I traced it with my finger. My spirit was crushed, and yet I was still here. Still, breathing. And suddenly, I knew I needed more than breath. I needed freedom. The next day, I called my sister. It had been almost 4 years since we last spoke. I had pulled away after Thomas intercepted one of our letters and accused me of stirring rebellion. When she answered, her voice cracked with surprise. Margaret? I couldn't speak at first. My lips trembled, fingers clutched tight around the phone. Are you okay? She asked, suddenly alert. Margaret, are you hurt? I'm tired, I whispered. She was quiet for a long moment. Do you need me to come get you? And for the first time, I said something I never thought I would. Yes. When I hung up the phone with my sister, my hand shook so badly I had to sit down. Not because I feared Thomas, though I did, but because saying yes had torn something open. The 37 years I had stitched my silence into the seams of my marriage. In one word, I had pulled out the first thread. I sat in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the spot where the vinyl floor had worn through. It was strange. The things your eyes notice when your heart is at war. I remember thinking how the peeling edge of the flooring curled like a ribbon, like something unfinished. A piece of the house giving up quietly. I wasn't brave yet, but I was tired enough to want change more than I feared it. My sister Ruth lived 2 towns over. She'd married young too, but her husband was kind, a mechanic who brought her coffee every morning and never raised his voice, not even when the car gave out or the roof leaked. Ruth had written me letters every Christmas for the first decade of my marriage. I never replied. Not because I didn't love her, but because love requires honesty, and I hadn't had any to give. When I told her I was ready, she didn't hesitate. Margaret, she said, her voice raw with something like anger and relief. Pack a bag. I'll be there tomorrow. Early. Thomas, I started. You let me worry about him. If he has something to say, he can say it to me. I hadn't cried on the phone, but after I hung up, I put my head down on the kitchen table and wept in a way I hadn't since childhood. It wasn't only grief. It was recognition. Somewhere beyond the bruises and the prayers twisted into punishment, there was someone still willing to fight for me. That night, I didn't sleep. I folded clothes. Not many. Just what I could carry in the small duffel bag Ruth had given me years before, back when she still believed I might leave. I packed a spare blouse, a worn sweater, and my Bible, the one I hadn't opened in months. Then, after a moment's hesitation, I placed my rosary gently in the side pocket. It had always been with me. During the beatings, during the nights of whispered prayers beside the tub while I cleaned blood from my scalp. But now it felt different. Not a chain, not a symbol of suffering. A companion, maybe. A reminder that God had heard me even when I thought he'd gone silent. I didn't pack photographs. I left behind the wedding picture on the mantel, the one where my smile had looked rehearsed even then. I didn't take my wedding band either. It sat in the porcelain dish by the sink, and I let it stay there like a relic in a house that had. Mistaken obedience for love. At 6:04 a.m., Ruth's car pulled into the driveway. She didn't honk. She didn't knock. She waited. I stood at the front door, duffel in hand, heart galloping in my chest like it was trying to outrun me. I hadn't written a note. I hadn't left a goodbye. I figured Thomas wouldn't notice until he came home, and the meat hadn't been thawed. I opened the door slowly. The morning air hit me like a flood, clean, cold, unfiltered. I had forgotten the smell of dawn when it wasn't trapped behind fear. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes as I crossed to the car. Ruth stepped out and opened the trunk. She didn't speak at first. She just opened her arms, and I fell into them. Her coat smelled like rosemary and soap. She held me so tightly, I thought I might break in a different way. This time into someone new. "I've got you," she whispered. And I believed her. We drove in silence for nearly 20 minutes before she spoke. "I want you to know," she sighed, eyes on the road. "There's no timetable. You don't have to explain anything." "I know," I whispered, but I wanted to talk. Not everything, just something. I needed to hear myself say it out loud. "It wasn't always like that," I began. "At first, it was ... small. Just his voice. Just his rules. Then it was bruises. Then it was prayer as punishment. He'd kneel beside me and ask God to correct me. I started to believe God was listening to him, not me." Ruth's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "God didn't send that, Margaret. You know that now, don't you?" "I do, but it's hard to untangle holy words from the mouths of cruel men." She didn't answer. She just reached over and placed her hand over mine. And in that moment, I didn't feel judged. I didn't feel pitied. I felt anchored. When we reached her house, her husband, Carl, was waiting at the door. He was taller than I remembered, with a weathered face and kind eyes. He didn't say much, only took my bag and offered me the guest room at the end of the hall. There was a quilt on the bed, hand-stitched, pale blue and white, with little crosses sewn into the border. I touched the edge of it like it might dissolve under my fingers. Soft things were unfamiliar to me. I had forgotten what it meant to be gentle with oneself. That night, Ruth made chicken soup. I sat at the table while she chopped vegetables. The kitchen was warm, the windows fogged with steam. Carl said grace. Before dinner brief, sincere. When he finished, I looked down at my bowl and felt something stir in my chest. It was the strangest feeling. Safety. And I hadn't realized until then how foreign it had become. Later, when I was alone in the guest room, I knelt beside the bed. Not out of habit, out of need. I clasped the rosary between my hands and prayed, not for forgiveness, not for strength to endure, but for healing. "God," I whispered, "I thought you left me. I thought silence was your answer. But maybe I wasn't listening. With the right ears, I didn't hear anything back. No thunder, no voice, but I felt a warmth settle into my bones. Like something had been waiting for me to return, not to a place, but to myself. The hardest part about leaving wasn't walking out the door. It wasn't facing Thomas's rage or the questions people would eventually ask. The hardest part came days later, when the silence stopped feeling like peace and started sounding like accusation. I had grown used to his voice filling every corner of the house. Every cupboard, every drawer seemed to echo with instructions he'd once barked. How to stack the plates, when to sweep the floor, what ingredients made a godly dinner. Even in Ruth's warm, generous kitchen, I caught myself flinching. At every drop spoon or sudden laugh, my body still moved as if permission were required. I spent the first week in a kind of half-existence, like I'd stepped out of a burning building, only to stand in the smoke. Ruth gave me space. She never asked when I'd be ready to talk. Instead, she brought me little comforts. A new toothbrush, clean towels, a basket of pears from the neighbor's tree. She sat with me in the mornings, sipping her tea while I stared out the window, trying to uncoil years of vigilance. It was on the 7th day that I opened the Bible again. Not the one Thomas gave me on our wedding day. He'd written inside the cover, "To Margaret, a Proverbs 31 wife in the making." That Bible felt like a weapon now, so I left it behind. The one I held was older, one I'd brought from home, passed down from my grandmother. The pages were soft with wear, the binding taped. Long ago, it smelled like dust and truth, I turned to the Psalms where I'd always found comfort. But something in me hesitated. Because it wasn't just Thomas I had to unlearn, it was the God he claimed to speak for. One afternoon, Ruth asked if I wanted to come with her to the market. It was a small place, run by a widow named Florence, who'd been a friend of Ruth's for years. The kind of market with handmade soap and jars of pickled okra, where everyone knew the difference between presence and intrusion. I agreed, if only to try my legs outside of their new cage. Florence greeted us with a hug and a smile, but her eyes lingered a moment too long on the faint bruising still visible under my sleeve. She didn't ask. She just handed me a jar of honey and sighed, "On the house. Sweet is what we need more of." I nodded, unable to speak, but something in my chest softened. Later that day, as Ruth was folding laundry, she spoke without looking up. "Margaret," she said gently, "have you thought about what you want next?" I didn't answer right away. The question sat heavy. Between us, I don't know what I want, I admitted. For so long, all I wanted was to survive the next night, the next Sunday. I don't know who I am outside of that. Ruth folded another towel. "That's okay. You don't need to know today. But maybe you could start by remembering who you were before." I opened my mouth to say I didn't remember, but that wasn't true. I remembered a little girl who used to sing hymns too loudly during church, who once dreamed of teaching Sunday school, who had loved helping her mother roll out pie crusts, flour clinging to her elbows, who'd believed that love was supposed to heal, not humiliate. That girl was still in there. Just quiet. The real test came when I visited the local church. It wasn't the church I'd fled from, but it bore all the familiar trappings. Wooden pews, stained glass, a steeple that touched the clouds. The pastor was new, young, open-faced, gentle in speech. Ruth introduced us afterward, and he didn't ask probing questions. Just said, "We're glad you're here," and meant it. But I couldn't go inside without trembling. The sanctuary looked too much like the one I had sat in week after week, bruises beneath my sleeves, listening to a gospel twisted into chains. I sat near the back, rosary in hand, and told myself I could leave at any time. When the pastor read aloud from 1 Corinthians, "Love is patient, love is kind," I closed my eyes and let the words sink in. For the first time in years, I didn't feel shame in the hearing. I felt grief. And then a strange, aching hope. Because that kind of love, the kind Scripture spoke of, had never lived in Thomas's fists. And maybe it still lived elsewhere. Maybe, someday, it could live in me too. That night, I went for a walk by myself. The neighborhood was quiet. The sidewalks littered with fallen leaves. I passed porches with wind chimes, dogs barking behind, fences, windows glowing gold with evening light. I stopped at a bench under a street lamp and sat down, clutching my rosary, eyes upturned to the stars just beginning to appear. And I prayed again, not out of desperation, but out of longing, not for God to change me, not to make me smaller or quieter or better suited to another's will, but to make me whole. "Lord," I whispered, "if you're there like I believe you are, then let me find you again." Not in the voice that hurt me, but in the voice that calls me beloved. The breeze stirred the branches overhead. A leaf landed softly in my lap. No thunder, no miracle, but I stayed seated, unafraid. And that was miracle enough for now. I knew Thomas would look for me. I also knew he wouldn't find me. Ruth had covered her tracks. She told no one I was staying with her. Not her pastor, not the neighbors, not even her closest friend. For the first time in decades, I existed in a space my husband didn't control. But fear doesn't let go easily. For days, I jumped at the sound of mail sliding through the slot. Every knock on the door made my pulse climb. I scanned parked cars through the curtains. I memorized the creak of every floorboard in Ruth's house so I could tell hers apart from anyone else's. Healing doesn't begin when you run. It begins when your body starts to believe you're safe. That took longer than I expected. The first time Ruth asked if I wanted to collect my things, I said no. She'd offered gently. "Only if you're ready," she said. "We don't have to go in. I can go, I can pack for you." I imagined her walking into that house, touching the edges of my former life. I couldn't bear it. "I don't want any of it," I whispered. "It all smells like him." The truth was, I had packed the only things I still cared about. A rosary, a pair of shoes my mother had given me, and a recipe card for lemon bread in my own handwriting. Everything else was noise. But weeks passed. Then a month. I began to feel different, less like a woman in hiding, more like a woman watching her future take shape through a fog. The time came when I wanted to walk through my old house. Not to reclaim it. Not to reopen anything. Just to face it and say, "You no longer have power over me." Ruth insisted on coming with me. "Not a chance you go alone," she said. "You think I'd let you walk into that place without backup?" So we waited until we were sure Thomas would be at work. Ruth had seen his pickup at the lumber yard that morning. I borrowed her car, a dusty blue sedan that smelled faintly of eucalyptus and mint gum. We pulled up slowly. The neighborhood looked smaller than I remembered, homes pressed close together, fences leaning with time. My hands tightened on the rosary in my lap. "You sure?" Ruth asked. "I have to see it," I said. "Just once. Then I can leave it behind." The front porch creaked under our steps. Paint chipped along the edges of the doorframe, and the doormat was curled at the corners. Everything looked frozen in time, like the world had held its breath since I left. I still had my key. I didn't need it. The door was unlocked. We stepped inside, and I froze. There was the hallway where he used to stand with his Bible. The mirror that once reflected every bruise I powdered over. The lamp I had once knocked over during an argument and glued back together before he saw. The kitchen was empty. The air felt hollow, as if it knew we didn't belong there anymore. I stood in the middle of the room and waited for a feeling: rage, grief, panic. Instead, I felt nothing, just a strange, echoing stillness. Ruth stayed near the door, letting me lead. I walked to the sink and opened the cupboard beneath it. That's where I used to keep the good dishes only brought out when Thomas's church friends visited. I opened the drawer with the tea towels, still folded just the way he'd expected them to be. I touched the counter. Cool, smooth. The spot where I once sliced my finger while making stew. I remembered him coming in, seeing the blood, and telling, "Be more careful." No man wants a wife who can't manage her own kitchen. I opened the refrigerator. Empty. He wasn't much for cooking. I turned and looked at the table. How many nights had I sat there, knees pressed together, hands clenched, beneath the wood, praying he wouldn't find something to correct. I sat in the same chair now, and I didn't flinch. After a few minutes, I rose and walked into the bedroom. The bed was unmade, his clothes scattered over the chair in the corner. There were 2 Bibles on the nightstand. One was mine. I picked it up. It felt foreign in my hands. I opened it slowly. Inside, a slip of paper fell out. I bent to pick it up. It was a church bulletin, dated 6 months before I left. On the back, in Thomas's handwriting, was a note: "Pray harder. Margaret is drifting. God, bring her back into your will." My lip trembled, but I didn't cry. I closed the Bible and set it down, not on the nightstand, but on the floor. He could find it there. I didn't need it anymore. Back in the hallway, Ruth met my eyes. "You okay?" I nodded. But then I stopped at the coat hook by the door. Hanging there, still dusty, was my mother's shawl. A faded rose-colored thing with small, stitched flowers along the edge. I hadn't even known it was still there. I reached out, pulled it down, and held it to my chest. The smell was faint lavender, dust, maybe a memory of Sunday dinners long gone. I kept that. That was mine. We stepped out into the sunlight, and I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The house could rot for all I cared. Its walls had heard. Too many prayers used like weapons. Its floorboards had carried too many bruised feet. I was done offering it any more of my breath. That night, back at Ruth's, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. The shawl was draped around my shoulders. I looked down at my hands that had once shaken while chopping onions, that had flinched under pressure, that had been raised in prayer for deliverance. And I whispered, "You're free now." Not to the room, not to Ruth, but to myself. 2 days after visiting the house, I woke up before the sun. I hadn't set an alarm, but my eyes opened to darkness that felt lighter than sleep. Something in me had shifted. Not a full transformation, just enough to notice I was breathing differently, deeper, as if I were no longer waiting for the next command. I rose quietly, careful not to wake Ruth or Carl. The house creaked beneath my steps, the old wood sympathetic in its size. I went to the kitchen, warmed a mug of milk, and sat by the window. Outside, the world hadn't stirred yet. No birdsong, no wind, just that pregnant stillness before the day unfolds. And in that stillness, I felt the quiet do something unexpected. It comforted me. For years, silence had meant danger. It had meant the pause before yelling, the breath before a slap, the hush that followed each punishment like a cruel echo. But now it didn't feel like threat. It felt like space. A space where I could start to hear my own voice again. Later that morning, Ruth brought in the mail and set it on the table. A brown envelope caught my eye plane, unmarked except for my name scrawled in a hand I knew too well. Thomas. Nat didn't touch it. Not at first. Ruth noticed me staring and said, "You don't have to open it." But I did. Not because I wanted reconciliation. I no longer wanted anything from him, but I needed to see who he was when he wasn't shouting, if there was any trace of truth in his pen. I opened it slowly. A single page. His handwriting neat, measured, rehearsed. Margaret, I forgive you for leaving. I know the enemy whispered lies into your heart, but I also know God can bring us back into alignment. I'm praying daily for your repentance. When you're ready to return to the path of obedience, I'll be waiting. Come home, where your covering still stands. Thomas, not a single question, not a single word of regret, just a demand wrapped in religious language. I folded the letter once, twice, and slid it into the trash without a word, and I felt no guilt. That surprised me. For years, I thought guilt was built into my bones. I thought leaving would stain me forever. But sitting there in Ruth's kitchen, with warm milk and a rising sun, I knew something deeper. I was not the one who needed forgiveness. That afternoon, I asked Ruth to drive me to the women's center, across town. I'd heard of it through her church mall, mostly volunteer-run, housed in a converted parsonage. I didn't know why I wanted to go. I only knew I needed to be around other voices that had once been silenced. The director, a woman, named Carol, greeted us at the door. She was short, with weathered skin and a handshake that said she'd lived through more than she shared. I told her I wasn't looking for counseling. I didn't need a bed or a lawyer. I just wanted to sit, to listen, maybe help. Carol nodded. You want to be near the work. I understand. She led me to a small room with 2 chairs, a bookshelf, and a table of brochures. A young woman sat there, barely 20, eyes hollowed by something recent and raw. She didn't speak, didn't look up. I didn't force conversation. I just sat across from her, rosary in my lap, fingers moving quietly through the beads. Not praying. A loud dot just holding space dot, and after a while, the girl whispered, "Did you stay for a long time?" I nodded. 37 years. She didn't cry, but her eyes blinked fast, like tears were waiting behind the dam. "I'm trying to leave," she said. "But I think I'm broken." I leaned forward slightly. "You're not broken," I said. "You were bent by someone who mistook control for care." "But bending isn't the same as breaking." She didn't respond, but she didn't leave a doubt sometimes. Silence is the start of healing. That night, I returned to Ruth's feeling something I hadn't in a long time: purpose. Not obligation, not duty, but purpose. And I started to write. Nothing formal. Just pages torn from a spiral notebook. Bits of memory. Prayers I used to say. Questions I still carried. I wrote about the belt in the kitchen drawer, the way Thomas's voice dipped when quoting scripture, the way the pastor never asked me why my wrists were bruised beneath my sleeves. I didn't plan to share it. Not yet. But putting words to paper gave shape to the silence I'd lived in for too long. One afternoon, while folding laundry, Ruth said, "You ever think about telling your story?" I looked at her over the basket. "You mean publicly?" She nodded. "There are women in church pews right now who are going through what you went through, but they think they're the only ones, that God expects them to endure it. I wouldn't even know where to begin." I said. Ruth smiled. "You already did. The moment you left." That evening, I lit a candle on the windowsill, opened my notebook, and wrote 5 words. God never used his fists, and for the first time I imagined myself not just as a survivor, but as someone who could help others survive too. Not with sermons, not with shame, but with truth. The first time I read my writing aloud, it wasn't to a crowd or a microphone. It was to Ruth, late one Sunday afternoon, while we shelled peas together on her back porch. The light was golden, the kind that softens everything. It touches. Carl had gone to visit a neighbor, and the only sounds were the quiet snap of pea pods and the crickets tuning up for the evening. I hesitated before beginning. The notebook felt heavier than it should in my lap, as if each word pressed itself against my skin from the inside out. Ruth didn't rush me. She kept working, hands busy but heart open. "I wrote this last week," I said, "but it's taken me until now to believe I had the right." She looked up. "You always had the right, Margaret. You just never had the space." I nodded, opened the page, and began. There were days when I thought God's silence was proof I was wrong, that every bruise was a divine correction, every prayer a test I was failing. But now I see what I couldn't see then. It wasn't God that hurt me. It was a man who spoke like thunder but lived like stone. My voice trembled, but I didn't stop. I read 3 pages about fear disguised as faith, about pain dressed in Sunday clothes, about finding fragments of my voice between verses that had once been used as chains. When I finished, Ruth's eyes were glassy. "Keep going," she whispered. It wasn't long before Carol from the Women's Center asked if I'd ever thought of sharing my story during group sessions. Not as therapy, but as offering. "We've got new girls coming in who don't speak," she said. "You wouldn't have to push them. Just show them what it looks like when someone lives to tell." The idea made my stomach knot. I had spent my entire life being small, silent, shaped to fit someone else's mold. Now they wanted me to speak as if I'd never been silenced. But something deeper stirred, a need not to be brave, exactly, but to be honest. I agreed, with one condition. No introductions. No fanfare. I'll come, I'll read. And if they want to leave, they can. Carol smiled. That's more than enough. The room was smaller than I'd imagined. Just a circle of folding chairs, a table with a box of tissues, a chipped coffee, mug holding pens no one used. 4 women sat quietly, none older than 30. One kept her hoodie pulled tight around her face. Another tapped her fingers against her knee like a clock ticking down the time until she could leave. I walked in with my rosary in one hand and my notebook in the other. No makeup. No suit. Just my story. I didn't start with the worst of it. I started with the small things. The way I used to check the mirror for signs of rebellion before stepping into the hallway. The way Thomas would say Amen after every insult. The way I prayed, not to be saved, but to become more invisible. As I spoke, something happened. Not dramatic. No tears, no sudden outbursts. Just stillness. Like the room had been holding its breath and finally remembered how to inhale. When I paused, I looked up. The woman in the hoodie was watching me now. Not openly, not defiantly, just watching. I finished with a sentence I hadn't planned. I used to think healing meant forgetting, but now I believe it means remembering without fear. They didn't clap. They didn't speak, but no one left, and that was enough. After that, Carol began inviting me regularly. Once a week, then twice. I never lectured. I just told the truth. In pieces. Sometimes the women told theirs back. Sometimes they didn't. One girl handed me a drawing, a tangle of red lines surrounding a small, grey figure in the center. This is what it feels like, she said. I kept that drawing in my notebook. It reminded me why silence had to be broken. One morning, I found myself in the church parking lot, the same one Ruth attended, not the one Thomas ruled. The pastor had invited me to speak at a women's breakfast. Just a short reflection, he said, on faith, on resilience. I almost said no. But Ruth took my hand. You're not stepping into the past, she said. You're stepping into what it could have been. Let that version speak now. So I stood in a room filled with muffins and floral tablecloths, holding my notebook and my rosary. I didn't tell them everything. Just enough. Enough to let the real gospel breathe again, outside the reach of control. I ended with the truth. I wished someone had told me. God does not live in bruises. He lives in restoration. And any voice that tells you otherwise does not echo from heaven. There were tears that day. Nods. One woman stood with her arms crossed for the entire talk, then walked up afterward and said, "You just described my marriage." And I thought I was the only one. "You're not," I said. "You never were." That night, I returned home, still Ruth's house, but now my refuge, and wrote 3 more pages. My handwriting was slower now, more deliberate, but the words came steady. I didn't know where it would all lead. I didn't need to. Each sentence was a stone, laid gently on a new path, and I was walking it, one word at a time. The letter came tucked inside a church bulletin, the kind passed out by ushers on Sunday mornings. It was slid under Ruth's door. While we were away at the market, no envelope, no return address, just that heavy cardstock stamped with the shepherd's voice weekly, and my name scribbled in pen across the margin. Stared at it for a long while before picking it up. Ruth was in the kitchen unloading groceries. I could hear her humming, the gentle clink of glass jars against wood as she arranged them on the counter. I walked outside. The porch was quiet, bathed in late afternoon sun. A breeze stirred the wind chimes. I sat on the top step, rosary still, in my pocket, and unfolded the bulletin. His words were written on the back, small and tightly spaced. I saw you speaking at the women's breakfast. You've made quite a show of your story. But Margaret, We both know truth isn't decided by how many people nod their heads. I was your husband. I was your spiritual covering. God joined us, and no woman can separate what he has joined. You've left your post, but I haven't left mine. Come home, Margaret, before the judgment falls on your pride. There was no signature, but there didn't need to be one. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me. There was a time when a note like that would have sent me straight to the bathroom, retching from fear. But now, I folded it calmly, set it beside me on the porch step, and let the sunlight touch the paper like an exorcism. That night, I told Ruth. She didn't yell, didn't pace. She only poured us tea, added 2 sugar cubes to mine, and asked, "Do you want to report it?" "I don't think he broke any law," I said. "Just broke the boundary I never got to have." She frowned. "That's still harm, Margaret. That's still a threat." I nodded. "But I won't respond." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. Because silence, when it comes from strength, is different than silence from fear." I wasn't hiding. I was refusing to play the game. Still, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the guest room with the quilt pulled to my chest and stared at the ceiling fan spinning shadows across the walls. The rosary lay beside me on the knitstand. I reached for it, not out of panic, but to center myself. My thumb slid along the beads, slow, steady. Hail Mary, full of grace. But I stopped halfway through the second decade. Because it wasn't prayers I needed right then. It was memory. I sat up, pulled my notebook from the drawer, and began to write. Again. This time, I didn't write about fear or pain. I wrote about the Sunday I helped a girl find shelter after group. Her name was Jenna, 19, pregnant. Her boyfriend had shoved her into a wall the night before and told her God would only forgive her if she stopped provoking him. She came to group with her hands folded so tightly they looked like stone. When I finished reading that day, she didn't speak. But after the others left, she lingered, and she asked, "Do you think God still loves me even though I ran?" I took her hand, and I said, "I think running might have been the first time you obeyed him." That moment had muttered more than any sermon I ever heard. And now it lived on paper. By morning, I'd written 12 pages. Some parts read like confession, others like testimony, but all of it was mine. I placed the notebook in my tote bag, alongside my rosary and a few flyers. For the center, that afternoon, I was scheduled to meet a woman named Alice. Carol said she was older, late 50s, and hadn't spoken much in her intake. She asked for someone who believes in God, Carol had said, but also someone who understands what happens when scripture is used to trap. I had said yes immediately. Alice sat in the corner chair of the center's reading room. She wore a thick shawl despite the warm weather, and clutched the small black Bible to her chest like armor. She looked up when I entered but said nothing. Didn't speak at first either. I sat opposite her, laid my tote gently on the floor, and took out the notebook. "I'm not here to give advice," I said. "But if you want to hear part of my story, I can read it." She nodded. So I did. Paragraphs in, she whispered, "He used to pray over me after every hit. He said if I flinched, it meant the demons weren't all gone." I stopped reading. She stared straight ahead. "I still hear him in my sleep, but I miss church. I miss God, and I don't know how to separate them." I reached for my rosary, held it in my hand, not to preach, not to teach, just to hold. And I said, "God wasn't the one who raised his hand, and he's still waiting for you outside of that house." Tears ran down her cheeks silently, as if she'd been practicing not to make sound for years. I didn't ask more. I stayed until she slept. When I got home, I sat on Ruth's porch again. The bulletin Thomas had left was still there. I hadn't thrown it away. But this time I picked it up, walked to the garden, and lit a match. The flame caught fast, curling the edges until the ink disappeared into smoke. I watched it burn until all that remained was ash, and I said aloud, not to Thomas, not to the past, but to the girl I had once been, "You are not a failed wife. You are a found woman." I didn't plan to speak in court. That was never part of my intention. For months I had lived in the quiet aftermath of reclaiming my voice, gently offering it where it was needed in group rooms, coffee circles, late-night phone calls from women too afraid to say their names aloud. That felt like enough. That was enough. But when Carol approached me one Tuesday afternoon with a manila folder pressed to her chest, I knew something was different. "He's being investigated," she said, quietly but without hesitation. "Not just for your case. For others. 2 women in the county over-filed reports." I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. The wood was warm from the sun, the kettle just beginning to whistle on the stove. "Thomas?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She nodded. "They reached out because one of the women heard you speak at the church breakfast. She said you described things she'd never been able to say out loud. They thought maybe you could help them prove a pattern." I stared at the steam rising from my tea. For a long while, I didn't respond. "I'm not asking you to relive it," Carol added. "But your truth might protect others." That night, I lay awake again, notebook unopened beside me. I didn't write. I didn't pray. I thought about all the nights I had spent hiding bruises, about the prayers Thomas had whispered while kneeling beside me, words that had always felt like rope. I thought about the girl in group who cried after hearing my story, because it was the first time she'd realized what happened to her wasn't holy. And I thought about my own silence, how long I had carried it. Loyal I had been to a lie just because it wore a cross. I rose before the sun, lit a candle on the kitchen counter, and whispered the same sentence 3 times. God's justice is not cruelty wrapped in scripture. In court, I wore the same cardigan I'd worn when I spoke at the breakfast. Muted rose. Nothing too sharp. Nothing too soft. Something steady. Carol sat beside me, her hand firm on mine. I wasn't the only woman in the room who would speak that day, but I was the oldest, the one with decades between the bruises and the breath to name them. When they called my name, I stood slowly, clutching my rosary in one hand and the edge of the bench with the other. My legs trembled slightly, not with fear, but with memory. The courtroom was cold, quiet. Thomas was there. He didn't look at me. I looked at him, and I began. I didn't start with the violence. I started with the vows. I told them how I met him in church, how his voice carried conviction and charm in equal measure, how everyone told me he was a man after God's own heart. I told them how he read the Bible aloud every morning, then used those same verses to control every corner of our lives. Then I told them the truth that had taken me nearly 40 years to say aloud. He didn't hit me despite being a man of God. He hit me because he believed God gave him permission. A murmur moved through the courtroom. The judge raised his hand for silence. I continued. Afterward, he'd pray. He would kneel beside me, sometimes while I was still bleeding, and ask the Lord to humble my rebellious heart. He called it sanctification. He called it marriage. He called it love. I paused. But there is no love in bruises. When I stepped down, I felt emptied, but not hollow, like something had been poured out, not drained. Carol squeezed my arm as I returned to the bench. "You did exactly what you came to do," she whispered. I nodded. I couldn't speak yet. Outside the courthouse, the air was heavy with summer. The sky was pale, washed out, but I could breathe it in. One of the women I had never met, young, Early 20s walked past me on her way in. She didn't say a word, but her eyes met mine, and I saw something I recognized: recognition, relief, readiness. And I knew she was next. That evening, Ruth made a roast for dinner. Carl set the table. The house smelled of rosemary and warmth. I sat in the living room with my notebook, legs tucked beneath me, candle flickering beside me. I didn't write about the courtroom. Not yet. Instead, I wrote about the first time I taught a group of women how to make lemon bread. Simple recipe. Nothing fancy. But the kneading, the measuring, the folding, something about it felt sacred. A prayer not spoken but made with the hands. They laughed. They cried. They said it reminded them that they were still capable of making something good. I wrote, justice isn't always a gavel. Sometimes it's a warm kitchen and a recipe passed down in love. The next day Carol called. The court had accepted the women's statements. Thomas would face formal charges. I sat on the edge of the bed and breathed, not in triumph, but in peace. For the first time in my life, a truth I carried had done more than survive, it had made a difference. A week after I testified, the house felt quieter than usual. Not empty, not haunted, just still. The kind of quiet that follows a long exhale. Carl had gone fishing for the morning. Ruth was tending the garden, speaking softly to the basil like it could hear her. I stood in the hallway holding a letter I hadn't yet opened, unsure what I was hoping for. It came in a plain white envelope. My name written in clean, printed script. No slant, no flourish. Neat, like a letter meant to be filed. I'd known, deep down, that something would come after my testimony. But I hadn't expected this. The return address wasn't Thomas's. It was a law firm. Stared at it for a few minutes before slipping it beneath the notebook on my desk. Not yet. There were other words I needed to write first. That morning, I began my own letter. Not to a person, not to Thomas, not even to God. It was to the version of me that never got to exist. Started with her name. Dear Margaret, the one who left sooner. And then I told her everything she never got to hear in time. You didn't fail by asking questions. You didn't sin by wanting tenderness. The weight wasn't yours to carry, and it never made you holy to bleed in silence. He used God's name, like a shield for his fists, but your bruises were never sacred. They were never required. I paused. Outside the window, Ruth knelt by the herbs, brushing dirt from the roots like an act of forgiveness. I continued writing. You are not broken glass. You are a whole woman who was lied to about love. And you are allowed to want joy. It was the letter I'd needed on so many nights. The ones where I whispered scripture into a cracked mirror and hoped obedience would earn me peace. Signed the bottom without my last name. Just Margaret. When I finished, I didn't cry. I folded the pages carefully, slid them into an envelope, and tucked it into my notebook. Not to mail, but to keep. Maybe someday, someone else would find it and read it and know they weren't alone. Then I returned to the letter from the law firm, opened it with steadier hands than I'd expected. It wasn't long. Just a notice that Thomas had filed a motion to delay the hearing, that he was citing emotional duress from the trial and slanderous public testimony as justification. No apology. No admission. Only retreat disguised as righteousness. Ruth saw my expression when I entered the kitchen. Bad news? She asked, wiping her hands on a towel. Predictable news, I said. He's trying to stall. She nodded. He won't win. I know. But still, it lingered in me. The knowledge that his voice, though smaller now, still reached through. Paper still tried to control the narrative. That night, I sat by the fireplace with my rosary, slowly working each bead through my fingers as the logs crackled and glowed. But I didn't pray for strength. Prayed for the women I hadn't met yet. For the ones still locked behind scripture, twisted into shackles. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I baked. The smell of cinnamon and nutmeg filled the house like a benediction. Ruth walked in from the porch, eyes wide. Is that what I think it is? Lemon bread and a spice loaf, I said. I thought the shelter girls might like something warm today. She grinned. You're starting to look like yourself. I wiped flour from my wrists and paused. I don't know if I ever met myself before now. At the shelter, I handed out slices wrapped in wax paper. One girl, barely 17, asked if I had made it from scratch. Yes, I said. With both hands and no fear. She looked confused. But she smiled. Later, I sat with a woman named Beatrice. Grey streaks in her hair. Fingers that kept tapping the hem of her shirt. She told me her husband had made her kneel for hours on rice if she questioned him during Bible study. You still believe? She asked. After everything? I do, I said. But not in the version of God I was taught. I believe in the God who opened the door. She nodded slowly. I want to believe that too. You can, I said, taking her hand. It's not too late. That night, back at Ruth's, I sat on the back porch and reread the letter I'd written to myself. I didn't change a word. I folded it again and placed it inside the back of my notebook. Then, I did something else. I began writing a guide. A short one. Just a list, really. 5 things I wish someone had told me sooner. Control is not the same as love. Obedience does not mean silence. Faith should never hurt your body. God hears you even when no one else does. Leaving is not failing, it's choosing to live. I stared at the list for a long time. Then I tore the page out, smoothed the edges, and taped it to the wall above my desk. Not for me. For the next woman who sat there. A few days after I finished the guide and taped it to the wall, Carol asked if I'd come speak at a Sunday evening prayer circle small group. Just a few women and one older couple, who'd started attending after their daughter left an abusive marriage. It's not about telling the hard parts, Carol said. They've heard enough of that. It's about what came after. About the God who stays. Her words lingered in me. I nodded without answering and told her I'd pray about it. But the truth was, I already knew I would go. Not because I had healed everything, but because I had seen what silence could cost, and I didn't want anyone else paying it. That Sunday, I stood at the edge of the sanctuary before anyone arrived. It was a smaller church, white clapboard siding, windows that let in more light than you'd expect. The carpet smelled of lemon cleaner. The folding chairs creaked with use. In front of the altar sat a table with tea candles already arranged in a loose circle. And behind it, a hand-painted sign that read, "He restores the broken-hearted." I reached out and touched one of the candles. Its wax was cool beneath my fingertips. I hadn't lit many candles in the years I was married. Thomas thought them frivolous, said the Holy Spirit didn't need ambience to move. But I had always felt closest to God when fire flickered nearby, not the kind that scorched, the kind that glowed low and steady, soft as breath. As I stood in that quiet room, I whispered a line I hadn't spoken aloud in decades. I miss you. And for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a confession. It felt like a reunion. The women came in slowly, 7 of them, maybe 8. And the older couple who sat in the back row with their hands folded between them. No one wore makeup. No one brought pretense. Just heavy coats, thermoses of tea, and stories held close to the chest. Carol gave a short introduction. Then she handed me the floor. I didn't read that night. No notebook. No guide, I just told the truth. Not the parts that bruised, the parts that built. I didn't leave because I stopped believing in God, I said. I left because I finally believed He hadn't left me. They listen the way people do when they recognize a road they've walked, even if the scenery was different. I used to think suffering was a kind of holiness, I went on. And if I just endured long enough, my bruises would bloom into something sacred. But now I know God doesn't bruise His beloved. He shelters her. I told them about the shelter. The girl named Jenna. The letter I wrote to the woman I never became. The 5 truths taped above my desk. When I finished, no one clapped. But the silence that followed was not heavy. It was reverent. The woman sitting closest to the altar leaned forward and whispered, "I didn't know God was still for me." I smiled. He never stopped being. That night, back at Ruth's, I sat in the kitchen sipping chamomile tea, while the clock ticked in the quiet. The window was open a crack, letting in the hum of crickets and the smell of earth cooling after the sun. My rosary sat on the table beside me, not gripped tight like in the old days, but resting gently, like a hand I could hold without fear. Thought of all the rooms I had once sat in, closets, corners, pews trying to become smaller, quieter, more acceptable. Now I sat in open rooms, warm kitchens, and prayer circles where I could speak with the weight of truth and not be told it was rebellion. The God I had found on the other side of the door wasn't the one who demanded silence. He was the one who waited for my voice in the morning. I walked to the bakery near the edge of town and ordered 2 loaves, one for Ruth and one for a woman at the shelter who hadn't spoken since she arrived. Bread has a way of saying things that mouths sometimes can't. The man behind the counter handed me a 3rd loaf. "On the house," he said. "For the work you do." "I don't do much," I replied. He smiled. "You show up. That's more than most." Later that day, I sat beneath the oak tree in Ruth's backyard, notebook in my lap. A squirrel darted past me. The wind picked up slightly, sending small leaves tumbling into the grass. I began writing something. New. Not a list, not a testimony. A letter. This one to God. I thought you were silence, but you were just waiting for me to stop mistaking pain for prayer. I thought you abandoned me, but you were outside the door, patient as mercy. I thought I had to suffer to stay in your favor, but now I know your favor was never behind His. FISTS. And not who I once was, and you're not who I feared you might be. Thank you for staying, even when I was too ashamed to open my mouth. Even when I thought bruises were devotion, I stopped writing and closed the notebook, looked up at the sky wide and steady and breathed in the new air of a life no longer hidden. It was a Tuesday morning when Carol called. Her voice was gentle, but there was something beneath it, carefully wrapped, but firm. "We had a girl come in last night," she said. "Young, won't give her name. She's scared and bruised. She asked for someone older. Said she didn't want counseling. Just ... someone who knows." I was standing in Ruth's kitchen drying dishes. I set the towel down and pressed the phone to my ear. "Does she want to talk?" "She doesn't know yet," Carol replied. "But she stayed. That's something." I told her I'd be there within the hour. When I arrived, the sky was overcast. Grey clouds stitched the morning horizon, casting a pale, quiet over the lot. I paused at the gate of the shelter, rosary in my coat pocket, notebook tucked under my arm, not to read from, but to carry, like a map that had already guided me out of a place I never thought I'd escape. Inside, Carol met me in the hallway. Her eyes were tired but kind. She hasn't said much. Wouldn't eat. Barely looked up. We walked to the common room. A girl sat in the corner, legs tucked beneath her, hood drawn low over her face. She couldn't have been older than 17. One sneaker on, the other kicked to the side. A chipped mug rested beside her, the tea inside untouched. Carol stepped back and nodded toward me. "Take your time." I crossed the room, slowly, making sure she could hear my steps. I didn't sit too close, just lowered myself into the chair, beside her with the quiet care you give to things that have already broken once today. No words yet, just breath. She glanced up once, saw the rosary in my lap, then looked away. "I'm not here to ask you questions," I said. "I'm here because someone sat beside me once when I couldn't speak." She didn't respond. I kept my voice steady, low. "I used to think love looked like obedience, like keeping quiet, like not flinching, like staying when it hurt. Still, nothing, that she wasn't moving away. I learned that love shouldn't feel like fear, and God doesn't ask you to bleed to be blessed." Her lip quivered slightly, then still. I waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, she whispered, "He made me pray after." I nodded. She looked at me then fully, and there was recognition in her eyes, the kind that makes your stomach twist and your hands go cold. I placed the rosary gently on the table between us. She stared at it, then at me. "What did you do?" she asked. "I left," I said. "I survived." And then I started telling the truth. An hour later, she was asleep on the couch in the back room. Her fists no longer clenched. Carol brought me a cup of warm broth. We sat together, not needing to say much. "You think she'll stay?" Carol asked. "I think she will if she hears her own voice one day." That's how it starts. I reached for the notebook, opened to a blank page, and wrote. Today, I saw myself again smaller, shaken, but not silenced. She doesn't have a name yet, but she has breath, and that's the beginning. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, at Ruth's, tracing the edge of the teacup, steam curling into the lamplight. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with a hush that felt almost holy. Ruth came in quietly, carrying the mail. A large white envelope sat on top. "From the county," she said, setting it beside me. I didn't reach for it right away. I finished my tea, let the silence do its work. Then I opened it. It was the final notice. Thomas had been convicted on 3 counts. He would not be eligible for parole for a long, long time. I let the paper fall back onto the table. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just sat with it. A verdict not just on him, but on the years that were stolen, and the truth that had waited too long to be spoken. Leaned her hand on my shoulder. "It's done," she said. "No," I replied. "It's beginning." The next morning, I went to the community center early. The rooms were still quiet, chairs unstacked, the kettle just beginning to warm. I walked to the bulletin board and tacked something, just beneath the weekly schedule. If you are hurting and afraid, but not yet ready to speak, sit in this room anyway. You do not owe anyone your story. That your story still matters. The door will stay open. I stepped back and stared at the words. Then I walked to the window, opened it, and let the morning breeze roll in. When the women began arriving, some smiled. Softly. One touched my hand and squeezed. Another pulled me aside and said, "My daughter heard you speak at the shelter. She called me last night. She's coming home." I pressed my hand to my chest. Not because of pride, but because the echo of healing is still a sacred thing. That evening I walked out onto the porch and sat down with my rosary in one hand and my notebook in the other. The marigolds Ruth had planted were blooming again, vivid, unapologetic. I looked out at the street, not waiting for someone to arrive, but grateful that I no longer had to leave parts of myself behind to be loved.